The title of my paper will be Bendectin, an American Tragedy. The paper will be a case study on the topic of pharmaceutical product liability litigation in the United States. I will focus on the scientific data on a drug called Bendectin and explain how these data were used and misused during the trials brought against Bendectin's manufacturer during litigation. I will discuss how the litigation came to an end and Bendectin was vindicated both by the courts and by consensus among the scientific community. The reason that Bendectin case study has been called a tragedy is that Bendectin's vindication came much too late, and I will discuss the reasons why this was the case. Bendectin was a drug prescribed for the treatment of nausea and vomiting in pregnancy, commonly referred to as morning sickness. This condition affects as much as 80% of women in their first trimester of pregnancy. Bendectin was first marketed by a company called Merrill in 1956 in the United States, and then in 22 other countries around the world. At the peak of its use, up to 25% of pregnant women in the United States used Bendectin. Then it was voluntarily withdrawn from the market as a result of adverse publicity and product liability litigation. The story of Bendectin unfolded in the aftermath of the thalidomide disaster. Thalidomide was first sold in Germany as an over-the-counter sleeping pill in 1956. It was discovered to be of benefit for the treatment of morning sickness and began to be used off-label for this purpose. Unfortunately, thalidomide caused severe birth defects in the babies of mothers who had taken it. The defects were mostly strikingly characterized by shortened, absent, or flipper-like limbs. The U.S. was largely spared this tragedy because this drug had not yet been approved for use in this country by the FDA. But over 10,000 babies were born with thalidomide-related malformations in countries where it was prescribed before it was banned from use. When Bendectin was first introduced, there was scientific data available to support the conclusion that it did not cause birth defects, although the data were somewhat limited. Because of the public awareness of what happened with thalidomide, Bendectin came under suspicion that it too might be causing birth defects. Having a baby with some type of congenital anomaly for unknown reasons is not uncommon. Because Bendectin was so widely used, that is, by up to 25% of pregnant women, Bendectin could be associated with birth defects simply due to chance alone, since more than 30 million babies were exposed during its market life. As a result, there were around 1,700 birth defects claims filed against Merrill. My paper will discuss the conflict between the scientific community and the U.S. legal system in their approach to causality assessment for the birth defects claims made against Bendectin. First, some background on the types of scientific data that were available. These included chemical structure activity analysis, in vitro studies, that is, studies done with cultured cells or tissues exposed to the drug, in vivo studies done in animals, epidemiology studies involving humans, and finally what's called secular trend analysis. This last type of data involves trend analysis of population incidence data before and after the drug was removed from the market. Over time, the scientific evidence in Bendectin's favor grew, especially the epidemiological evidence. In the early 1990s, there were 39 epidemiology studies on Bendectin. Epidemiology studies are the only type of data that directly address the association of Bendectin with birth defects in humans. And from the point of view of the scientific community, the weight of the evidence did not show an association with birth defects. But this is where a conflict existed between the legal standard for causation in civil liability lawsuits, that is, the so-called preponderance of evidence standard, and the statistical confidence standards that scientists employ. When the scientific evidence in pharmaceutical liability cases is presented to a jury, it typically involves the testimony of scientific experts and ends up being a battle of these experts. To jurors who are not scientists, it is difficult, if not impossible, to make judgments on the basis of what these experts say. The term junk science has been applied to the data cited by expert witnesses who provide an opinion that differs from the opinion that is held by the majority of the scientists in the field. In the case of Bendectin, it would probably be better to use the term junk interpretation of the science by the plaintiff's experts. Another problem in jury trials is that the typical juror would prefer that lawyers present a believable story rather than present complex scientific data. The story that the plaintiffs told the jury was that Merrill was negligent in testing Bendectin and that it turned out to cause birth defects. Because the jurors did not fully understand and could not critically evaluate the epidemiology data, which was the strongest part of Merrill's defense, they undervalued it. The presiding judges were more capable in evaluating the epidemiology data and the conclusions that could be drawn concerning causality assessment. The outcome of the litigation that occurred over nearly a 20-year period was that all verdicts made by juries favoring the plaintiffs were reversed by the judge upon appeal, and none of the plaintiffs ever received a monetary award for liability or damages. Also of note, in 1993, one of the Bendectin cases, Daubert versus Merrill, went to the Supreme Court because of challenges made by the defense regarding the admissibility of scientific evidence. This landmark ruling set new standards for the admissibility of such evidence and the qualification of scientific experts. Judges were to serve as gatekeepers in this process. But this was all too little and too late. Bendectin had been voluntarily withdrawn from the market in 1983 because the litigation made it unprofitable to continue selling. The tragedy of this case study is clearly not that Bendectin caused birth defects. The secular trend analyses published after its withdrawal from the market confirmed the epidemiological data because there was no change in the incidence of birth defects. What was observed, however, was a doubling of hospitalizations for severe nausea and vomiting in pregnancy. What the Bendectin litigation and its market withdrawal led to was the lack of any FDA-approved medication for morning sickness for a period of time of 30 years. Finally, in 2013, the US FDA approved a new drug application submitted by a different company other than Merrill for a drug containing the same ingredients as Bendectin for the treatment of morning sickness. This is really the only bright spot in the story.